Go ahead and welcome to Resistance Radio, as if you need to hear it from me, right? So, Happy New Year, America. I shouldn't be laughing this much. Sorry. My co host, Regan Delagas, it is so great to welcome you to the new year.
Always happy to be here with you.
All right. Now, look, I just compared myself to a NASCAR fan today. I said, I'm like a NASCAR fan. I don't care who wins or loses. I just want to see the wrecks. Um, Look, I hate to sound like I'm gloating or anything, but look, I've been calling for this stuff. I just posted something that I posted 2 years ago where I said, look, this is a train wreck. And this isn't just a Trump train wreck. This is what happens when a country is built on racism, on slavery, on genocide, misogyny. When you build a country on lying to people, and and you say, when I say lie, I mean talk about life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. All men are created equal. When you don't mean it, when you create a country with this kind of rhetoric, and then you prop up all of these heroes in your history, and you erase all the bad stuff. You leave out the terrorism. You leave out having slaves that are really your sex slaves. You leave out massacres and all of the treachery that all of these so-called founding fathers, these American heroes, are responsible for. When you leave all of that stuff out, as Malcolm X said, eventually the chickens come home to roost, and that's what we saw yesterday, and so we're going to talk about that. Regan, obviously, you and I look at this thing through a little different lens, and part of it is about being Native. Part of it is about being an activist. Part of it has to do with being on the receiving end of uh, law enforcement when we're trying to advance a cause, and not being so numb to what we're actually watching. So we're going to talk about this thing, and we're not going to say perhaps something you haven't heard already, but we're going to put some finer points on some of this stuff. So again, this is it. This is Resistance Radio in 2021, in the waning days of the Trump presidency, but not out of the woods with the spiral that the United States is in by a long shot.
No, not at all. I mean, this is just the beginning. I would argue the amount of legitimacy that is being propped up, the lack of any sort of retribution, the lack of reaction by the media, by the general public, is just a reminder that this is truly just the beginning of this chaos that is what people are referring to as an insurrection or a coup, which it's none of those
It's
things.
none of those things. Yeah, we got to be clear about that.
Yeah, it's yeah. I really definitely want to clarify this. This is not an insurrection. This is not a coup. Neither of those. The coup requires for you to be going against the mainstream government belief, and the reality is they're actually in alliance with mainstream government belief. So I want people to understand that this is not outside of the realm of possibilities. This isn't just an exceptional moment in American history. This is, as you said, a consequence of hundreds of years of suppression of the realities of histories of white supremacy within the United States.
Well, and again, in order for this to be a legitimate, if there is such a thing, insurrection or coup, there has to be like this real sense that those folks who went into the Capitol were trying to take something over, and they weren't. This was just a vulgar display. Let's call it what it was. I mean, they didn't go in there to take over the United States. They didn't go over there to look. They didn't even really believe that they were going to change what Congress was supposedly assembled for. They were just being disruptive. This was just. Look, we would call this, an action. That's what in the activist community we would call this, some sort of act of civil disobedience. And at best, that's what this was. I mean, they didn't go in there, shooting people. One person got shot. I don't know even how the other people died, but and there was complicity on the side of not just senators and congressmen who were assembled there, but the police. And so I want to talk about that. But again, I think it's really important that people understand that what this is being called, like this attempted coup, it's not even close to that. And the fact that the media is trying to turn this, embellish this thing and then and enhance this thing so it meets their targets for viewership and that kind of stuff. I mean, shame on them. I mean, I listened to some of the folks in the media saying how truly heartbreaking it was and how their eyes were filled with tears. No, they weren't. I mean, look, this was a media frenzy. I mean, even the folks who had their equipment smashed, by some of these protesters didn't really look like they were in fear. They were standing right there taking pictures of it all.
I think that I have a special place in my heart for people, for journalists, for people in the media, and I think it's like an interesting form I'm trying to think of the best way to say this. I think it is interesting to see how people react in times of crisis or violence. And I think that seeing the Associated Press journalists have all their equipment destroyed and for them to just be stepping back and taking pictures, I understand that a journalist's intention is to be an observer, almost in an anthropological way. You're there to record, you're not there to participate. But I also wonder, at what point does that no longer work? At what point do you participate by just watching? And I'm not saying necessarily just what was happening with yesterday, but especially when there's police violence against people at like Black Lives Matters protests, I see a lot of journalists come into those spaces, take pictures, and witness violence without participating. And that was something that I was interested to unpack, maybe not today, but at some point, is like, what is the role of these people who are coming to witness, to inform the public, and then to see what is actually being portrayed in the media as this like very grandiose, over-the-top explanation of the realities of what happened yesterday. Calling something a coup is honestly, for me, it was a little disrespectful, considering the fact that there are real coups. My mother is Guatemalan. Guatemalan people experienced a real military coup based in violence and genocide that was sponsored by the CIA, that was sponsored by U.S. military. And so for people to be calling these, this display of truly toxic and fragile masculinity in the Capitol a coup is just incorrect.
I think of Hawaii, and I think of what some really what people have experienced, and whether the United States has backed these coups or whether there is a genuine effort to right a wrong with these things. And of course, most of the time, a coup is associated with the military somehow taking the reins of power, and of course, that's anything but true. Although I gotta say, I wonder how many of the people brandishing these Trump flags, how many of them were former military, how many of them are cops in their local hometowns who decided to make this trip. There's and we'll talk about some of the people who participated in this stuff, and there's one guy in particular that jumps out at me, the guy who some people think is native because he's got tattoos and wore a buffalo, looked like he had a buffalo head on his head or something like that. But that moron who has actually showed up, and he does kind of symbolize some of that new age, aggressive kind of hippie segment that says we're going to go in there and we're going to help Native people fight back. And those people showed up at Standing Rock. Those people have showed up, and oftentimes they try to steal the stage, even as Native people are trying to stand up. And I look at this guy and I'm thinking, yeah, he's emblematic of the kind of people who've infiltrated our territories, coming in supposedly as allies, but then have their own agenda. So when I saw that guy, and of course, a lot of people says, dude, I gotta ask, do you know who this is? Well, how the hell would I know who this is?
I mean, his name is Jake Angley.
Mm-hmm.
I was doing a lot of research, and by research, just the usual internet sleuthing
Yeah.
of who he was, because I really do want to touch on him particularly in terms of this in this moment, because him being there. Okay, so let me rewind. For those unaware, Jake Angley, I think is how you pronounce his last name.
Angeli, I think he called himself. I saw. Yeah, I saw.
Angelli. Okay,
Angeli,
great.
yeah.
He and I'm not like outing him or doxing him. He's been very public about his name. I just want to clarify that so that I don't get attacked online. But he is known as the QAnon shaman. That's like his whole push. He's he is like one of the biggest supporters of the QAnon conspiracy. For those who are unaware, it's a conspiracy theory that Democrats and other members of government participate in child pornography rings, are in big business pockets with the intention to continue to corrupt both children and the state under this like neoliberal agenda. There's a lot more that goes into that, so I recommend that folks who are interested do a little research in it, because there's a lot, and most of it is just complete chaos conspiracy theories. And like, don't get me wrong, I love a good conspiracy theory, but these are absurd.
Pizza Planet kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, like
Pizza Gate or whatever they call it.
I'm
Yeah.
more on the like aliens are real conspiracy theory kick. He's on a very different conspiracy theory kick. So I definitely recommend that people look into it. But that's who he is, and he's from Phoenix, Arizona, and he shows up at a number of events, and he's often dressed in these like very I'm going to use the term shamanistic because it's the term that's been used to describe him, which of course is culturally appropriative.
Stereotypically too. Yeah, stereotypical.
Yeah. And it's usually covered in animal pelts. He has a lot of tribal tattoos, and he is a self-proclaimed shaman. He says that he has the ability to travel through different dimensions, and that's why he knows so much about what's actually happening in the government. But the reason that his presence is so important is because him being at the Capitol, dressed with what's supposed to be buffalo horns, a buffalo hide, with tribal tattoos, and he wasn't the only one. His image has just become popularized through the media, but there's a number of other men who also dressed in animal pelts. It harkens to what this country is based off of, and I would not put it past them for being aware of this, that this is just a reflection of the Boston Tea Party, in which white colonists dressed as indigenous people, specifically as Mohawk people, to pour the tea into the Boston Harbor. And it was meant to be a declaration of it's a complete antithesis of the American identity, is the indigenous identity. So to encompass that is meant to show, or meant to flex, this system view. So it's important that folks understand that this has been seen before, that it being exercised now is not new, but in fact that white people, when needing to exercise anti-government authority, choose to dress as indigenous folks. And some people might say, oh, well, he's meant to be dressed like a Norse, like mythos, someone from Scandinavia, but the actual animals and the pelts that are being chosen are from here, from the occupied United States, from North America. And there are multiple images of him in his home with dream catchers, wearing native regalia. This is not the first time that this has been seen. So I think it's important that folks see that there is a parallel historically to white men, white colonists, white settlers dressing as indigenous people in times of insurrection. And I say insurrection because in quotes as well, because this is not an insurrection, but in displays of toxic masculinity, of fragile masculinity, we have seen this historically happen before. This is not new. This is cultural appropriation in a very interesting and specific way.
Yeah, and like I said, this guy has made the rounds, and although he is associated with QAnon, because there was even some debate about the link between QAnon and the the very specific pro-Trump movement. But those things have melded to such a large extent right now. And obviously you have, people like, Alex Jones and some of these other people who've kind of go back and forth with all this stuff. But there is no question that this guy and is promoting, Trump and Trumpism. And I say that because even some of the Democratic congressmen and senators have suggested that the people who breached the Capitol were Antifa and Black Lives Matter protesters posing as Trump followers, just trying to again talk about trying to do the whole double agent thing here. You got a white guy dressed as somewhat of a native shaman who the people that he is advocating for are saying, "Oh no, that's really a Black Lives Matter Antifa guy who's posing as a Trumper in native." It doesn't even make sense, but it's important that people realize that the amount of deflection that is happening here is pretty incredible, and it just kind of shows you how dug in some of these people are.
Yeah, the representative from Florida, his name. I forgot his name right now, but he said that these are Antifa dressed as Trump supporters, and that this is not actually a representation of the far right, which is so important because this is gaslighting. First of all, this is gaslighting. We see our government, and I say our, though it's not mine, but this is the federal government gaslighting the public into believing, into convincing that people who display white supremacy, who display violence against people of color, who are proud to display those things, are in fact not far right. Because that doesn't exist in America. We can't have there isn't a race problem in America. So for me, that was an incredible shift to see a state representative gaslight the nation into trying to, and people believe it, by the way, for folks who might be like, oh, wow, that's insane. People believe it because, unfortunately, a lot of people still have trust in this government and therefore have trust in their state representatives. And people truly do believe that, no, this was not a show of white supremacy in the far right. In fact, it is Antifa who is, and by the way, the misunderstanding of what Antifa is incredibly frustrating.
Yeah.
But as someone who identifies as an anti-fascist, I think it's incredible to see the lengths that the settler colonial state will go to maintain the narrative that, in fact, it's the far left that perpetuates violence. Which, don't get me wrong, I'm not against violence. I'm a firm believer that violence is necessary for revolution, for change, for real insurrection. But it's incredible to see that white representatives are so quick to disassociate themselves from the far right when the reality is the far right is the status quo.
Right. Well, and I think, that's what kind of gets missed in this. Anybody who tries to say that this is a few deranged people, look, over 30,000 people showed up in Washington. They were beckoned there by Donald Trump. Donald Trump called for people to show up there for the Stop the Steal rally or whatever else they were calling it. They had a few names. And look, they knew they were coming. The Capitol Police knew they were coming. The DC Police knew they were coming. Everybody knew that these people were, and they knew that they were there. I mean, so there was no question, that this group was assembling there, and why they were assembling. It was clear, and in fact, moments before they went and marched on the Capitol, this tens of thousands of people. Trump was telling them they needed to march on the Capitol. It's interesting because he kept saying, treat the police nicely. I mean, even as he was telling them that they had to use force and be forceful, and they needed to fight. It's interesting, and we'll get into part of the reason that this is so interesting, but he was telling them to go there and cheer the senators and the congressmen who were opposing this ceremonial electoral, college vote confirmation, and and to not cheer, basically, speak out against anybody else who wasn't trying to overturn the election. And so this wasn't just a few people. These were people who were basically taking direction from not just from Donald Trump, but his kids that were taken to the stage. Rudy Giuliani that was advocating that this was a battle. I mean, they were literally calling this a fight to save the country. So that's the hype that they were promoting with all of this stuff. And so anybody who wants to say that this was just a few that were not really Trump followers, I mean, it's just plain simple BS.
I think that what you're saying is so important because people need to understand who are listening, especially white people who are listening right now, that you do not in this time of white supremacy get to divorce yourself from these people. You can't just be like, oh, these are just a few thousand crazy people. Oh, look at you can't be critical and avoid the reality that this is not just a few crazy people. This was an organized group. This was an organized group of people. Actually, arguably, many groups of people. You have Proud Boys there. You have actual white supremacists there. You had Nazis there. You had John Mouse and Ariel Pink, who are both indie musicians that hipsters love. They were both there. You had a number of people from the spectrum of whiteness in that space supporting, whether peacefully at the rally or going into the Capitol. You had an immense amount of variety of whiteness in that group. And so it's really important for the people listening to this, the white people listening, that you don't get to divorce yourself from these people. This is part of the society. This is a part of American society. This is a part of whiteness. These are your aunts, your uncles, your cousins, your grandparents, your children. These are all of the same people that you don't get to take this time to remove yourself.
Yeah, these are your neighbors. I mean, let's be clear. Busloads went from Buffalo, the radio market, the TV market that I'm in here. They sent busloads of people there. So you have to assume that any of the people in your neighborhood who have the Trump flags flying, who have the Confederate flags flying, still this many days after after 2 months after the election, that it's those people. Those are the people. So that are a part of all of this because it's the same mentality. So. And there are groups, like you said, various groups that have signed on to this stuff. But, I've listened to city after city after city say, yeah, busloads came from here, busloads came from here, busloads came from here. So this wasn't just, one, chapter of an organization. These were community groups who actually were selling bus tickets to have people go down there. I mean, that's what was at play here. And every one of the people who got on that bus was there to support Donald Trump's effort to overturn the election. Every one of them.
I also, something that I really want to touch on, and I think will have to be unpacked in the future a bit more, is the inherent anti-Semitism that exists within the far right. So for people listening to this, and who are unaware, anti-Semitism is a hatred and prejudice against Jewish people. And it made my stomach churn, the amount of anti-Semitic T-shirts that a lot of these people at the Capitol were wearing. If you haven't looked it up, please do, including a man who was at the Capitol who was within the chamber wearing a hoodie that said Camp Auschwitz. And then had a skull and crossbones, and underneath said "Work will set you free." There was another shirt that was worn by someone that said six. What was it? Six, and it was six was not enough. So WN.
Oh, 6 million. 6 million wasn't enough.
So it stands for six was not enough, or 6 million was not enough, which is in reference to that 6 million Jews who were murdered during the Holocaust was not enough. There was a number of other really anti-Semitic things, including this person that we were speaking about before, this QAnon shaman, Jake Angley, has a huge chest piece tattoo that includes an anti-Semitic symbol. So I think that for people to also not understand is that whiteness and white supremacy is often participating in Nazism, and that there were extreme displays of anti-Semitism and Nazism in the Capitol yesterday. I mean, of course, and anti-blackness, of course, there were Confederate flags in the Capitol.
Yeah. Well, and I gotta look. I gotta ask though, how do Jewish Republicans? I mean, how is that even still a thing? I mean, when you realize that the right has become, it's so overrun by these anti-Semitic, ideologies. I mean, how is that even a thing anymore?
Well, I mean, it's the same way that how are there Zionist Jews still in the world? Like, how are people still supportive of the Israeli state, knowing that it's a state that completely participates in the genocide of Palestinians? Like, these are, for me, it's just like so. I mean, in the same way, like, how do women vote for Trump?
Yeah,
like,
I
there
guess.
are such contradictions. Like, there are such contradictions in the spectrum of whiteness, and I just wanted to point out the overt anti-Semitism, because I think that folks may be unaware about certain symbols that are actually very prevalent throughout daily life, throughout society, and that you may see people wearing the 6MWE shirt and not be aware of what it is, or that you might see people, like, these are realities. There's someone creating these things that are then being sold, and then it's being worn in the Capitol. And then the president of this settler state is saying that they are special and we love you.
Yeah.
That's an incredible moment. Like, I'm almost lost for words as to how overtly racist this is and how so quickly people can write it off.
Well, and again, there are still, look, I know some of the senators, grab a microphone in front of a camera to say they were no longer supporting their opposition to the Electoral College, the ceremonial thing they were doing yesterday. But not all of them, and some of them, have doubled down on this stuff. I mean, even people who want to condemn what took place yesterday are still saying, "Yeah, I don't know why Donald Trump did this. He was such a great president." You still have Republicans. I hear them from this area, and there's two congressmen from Western New York. One of them who was a part of that group that was trying to stop the confirmation of the Electoral College votes, and another one who said, "Yeah, I wasn't going to be a part of that." And I don't think this should be Donald Trump's legacy because he's been such a great president. So when I hear this stuff, I'm thinking, based on what? But I got to tell you, we're going to break here just for a second. I got to leave this nugget here. And this is what should be really disturbing to those who are really trying to take a look at this thing. Regan, if you take COVID-19 off the map, Donald Trump is reelected in November.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, so in the absence of a pandemic that, yeah, true, he mishandled it. But in the absence of a pandemic, and I heard some people try to stretch and say, well, you take the murder of George Floyd off, off the table, and COVID-19, and Donald Trump is reelected. And I'm sorry, but that's true. That's true. I mean, the fact that these elections were even close, including the one, just a couple of days ago in Georgia, the fact that they're even close just kind of shows you how deeply entrenched this division is, and it is along, not just racial lines, but white supremacy lines. I mean, it is 70 million, and I don't care who wants to argue with me on this. There are 70 million white supremacists who are still in Trump's corner right now today.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's an incredible. It's kind of daunting now that you say that out loud.
All right, hey, we'll take a break when we come back. When we come back, I do want to talk about how this was even possible, because I'm sorry, I'm not the only one saying it. I'm not sorry, but this was a setup. This was a setup. This was allowed to happen. Not just was it encouraged to happen, And it kind of indirectly, incited. It was allowed to happen, and we're going to talk about that when we come back. This is John Kane with Regan DeLoggins. This is Resistance Radio. We'll be back after this. Reggie, I got to give you credit, man. You pull up a perfect Murray Porter song for Donald Trump.
Hey, I'm just letting you know that I'm listening, man. I'm paying attention. I'm learning everything. And I agree 1,000% with everything that you said, but you don't need me to say that. Continue on with the show, please.
Well, who knew that there's a Murray Porter song that's perfect for all occasions? It's just amazing. All right. Hey, before I get into it, let me remind people that we are listener-supported radio, and we do need your support. I encourage people to go to the pledge line, 516-620-3602. That's the number to call to make a contribution to WBAI. I'd appreciate it if you do it in the name of Resistance Radio with John and Regan. So you send a message that you appreciate the perspective. Look, even if you don't agree with us, just know that this perspective exists. And the reason we have this perspective is because of our life experiences and what we've gone through. So, I ask you again, go to the pledge line, 516-620-3602. Make a pledge of any size. You can become a buddy. You can make a timed payment. You can make a one-time contribution to WBAI, but do it in the name of Resistance Radio. All right. So when this thing goes down, there's a few things that are obvious. One is we know that Washington, D.C. and the Capitol grounds are generally a very secure place when it comes to, by secure, I mean there's lots of cops. And when the Black Lives Matter rally took place in Washington, D.C., they had cops in riot gear lined up shoulder to shoulder along the Capitol steps. There was police presence. There were helicopters in the air. There was all kinds of police presence there. And look, like I said earlier, they knew that tens of thousands of people were coming. How do they know? Because the president was asking them to show up. The president of the United States was asking people to show up for this rally. They had a stage set up near the White House. They had, this was organized for tens of thousands. And by some estimates, there was maybe 30 or even 40,000 people who showed up. I don't know. There were probably more people showing up for Trump the loser than showed up for his inauguration, I might add. We'll just throw that out there. So when when the story breaks that they've reached the Capitol, the big question has to be is, how the hell is that even possible? Then you start seeing videos. And some videos are suggesting, oh, look, the cops were overrun. And of course, all of the hype is all those brave Capitol Police. They did the best they could and they were outnumbered. Well, for one thing, why? Why were they so outnumbered? There's supposed to be like 2,000 or in the thousands of these cops. Where were they? And why weren't the National Guard or anybody else? They knew what was going down. They knew exactly why they were there and what they were protesting. They knew that it was directly connected to what was going to take place in the Capitol. So they knew all that. But then as you see the video, you start to realize that some of these cops were complicit. I saw a specific video that had the cops moving the barricades that allowed these people to advance on the Capitol. Now, I'm not saying all of the cops were complicit, because it appears from some of the stories that I've heard today that one of the entrances to the Capitol basically provided almost unfettered access. The people were able to come through there without any resistance. And the cops didn't offer any resistance. There were some of the other places, and I guess there were 3 breaches of the Capitol. In 2 of the other breaches, the cops did try to resist, and they did try to stop them from coming in. But there were already people running through the Capitol by the time, because there were some police, and they were posing for pictures, with selfies with some of these guys. Mm. So what happened to the thousands of cops? Because there weren't thousands of people inside the Capitol. I mean, the breach didn't involve thousands of people. There may have been a couple of hundred. I mean, there was plenty of trespass or people being where they shouldn't have been outside the building, but inside the building, how was there not enough of a police presence to subdue those who had made it, and not just made it into the Capitol, but made it to Pelosi's office and took pictures of themselves there. They were in all. I mean, they trashed a bunch of these congressmen, and I'm not defending any of these Congress people, but there's only one way this was possible, and I also want to add that, as I said earlier, when Trump was telling people to go to the Capitol, he kept saying, "Be nice to our good people, good men in blue." And in retrospect, I'm thinking, yeah, because he had some of these guys in his pocket. This was a setup. This was a setup.
I definitely, when people are saying, "Oh, this is a coup, this is an insurrection, this is terrorism," or whatever, whatever the terms that are being used, I think that the best tweet that I saw today was someone was like, "It is none of those things. This was an alliance." And that really resonated with me, because the reality is that this was an alliance between the federal government, the general public, and the police. And that alliance has existed for a very long time to maintain white supremacy. We've spoken about this a lot. And we saw it exercised yesterday with the opening of the gates to allow people into the Capitol, with the the police, the couple of areas where police attempted to hold the line and were quickly enveloped by a wave of white supremacy, is also poignant to this alliance, because the intention was never to protect the Capitol. The intention was never to hold the line, to keep people out, because you can see the lack of planning and the lack of resistance is a perfect example of that this was meant to happen. This was allowed to happen, whether planned, which arguably I think is a great point, or whether in the moment there was no resistance because it was an intentional lack of resistance. Opening the gates to allow people into the Capitol, or undermanning certain areas, allowing the walls to be climbed, like this was done. This was allowed to happen. I just can't think of any other language, and I understand that it sounds a bit repetitive at this point, but this was a part of it. This was not a surprise or shocking. It was planned and allowed to happen this way. You saw police taking selfies with some of these people. This is the same thing that we saw in Portland when I forgot his name because I purposefully don't want to give him any credit, was when that young white supremacist shot and murdered someone, and the cops offered him water.
Oh, you mean in Kenosha? In Kenosha, yeah, absolutely.
Oh, sorry,
yeah.
Kenosha. I apologize. Yes, in Kenosha. And we saw that this is the same thing. You see cops taking selfies with white supremacists because they are the same people. This was just a bunch of, I saw a really funny tweet that was only funny because it's horrible, which was that this wasn't white supremacists and police fighting one another, but this was when you show up to the club and the bouncer lets you in because he knows you.
Yeah.
And I was like, you're absolutely right. That is the reality. This was meant to happen the way that it did, because if they wanted to keep them out, they would have kept them out.
And here's the other part to this. And because whatever took place on the breach was one thing, but even when the cops showed up in number, when they were assembled and they were all there, whether it was National Guard or wherever all these troops of cops showed up afterwards, and they were supposedly going there to enforce the 6 o'clock curfew. One of the things that was noticeably absent, and keep in mind here, the word was they were going to strictly enforce a 6 p.m. curfew, and those who were still not off the streets were going to be arrested. There was not one single police officer, not one, that had one of those big bundles of white nylon zip strip handcuffs on their side. They didn't. They weren't there with any intention to arrest anybody. Not only did you see, one of the police officers helping one of those those women down the steps. I mean, she was healthy enough to climb the steps of the Capitol and violate and breach the Capitol compound, but she needed to be walked down like she was some fine lady down the steps. But these cops didn't have any of those nylon handcuffs, so they didn't even plan to arrest people.
In fact, if nobody has seen this image, I highly recommend you look it up. In fact, one of these white supremacists, Proud Boys, whatever they might identify as, was in the chambers when they got into the chamber, was in the chamber with zip ties on his belt, which is...
They had them, right. They had them.
Act of terrorism.
Yep.
If I just can't believe it. Like, they were prepared to do some wild things. Now, the fact that police didn't have these zip tie nylon handcuffs on their belts is incredible, because I remember at every action this summer when we were in solidarity with Black Lives, every cop had dozens of those on their belt.
And I haven't heard anybody even bring this up. I haven't heard anybody bring this up, but you don't see any of those cops with these zip ties.
None, because there was no intention to arrest anyone.
Exactly.
Even though many of those people were armed with automatic assault rifles.
Molotov cocktails, pipe bombs. Yeah, all kinds of stuff, yeah.
Absolutely. Those guys came there to participate in real acts of violence, and none of the cops had any of those zip ties, any of those nylon handcuffs. None of them did. But when we show up in solidarity with Black Lives after witnessing continued police violence against our Black kin, we were met with hundreds of cops with thousands of zip ties ready to arrest. And I remind people that over 14,000 people were arrested this summer in solidarity with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and their murders, their unjust murders. 14,000 over, that's the estimated amount.
And that doesn't include...
What was it, eight?
And that doesn't include the assaults. I mean, you yourself were violently assaulted by a police officer in New York City, just standing there, and got blindsided by a guy who was at least 100 pounds bigger than you. He was a big man. And the video was very clear. There were instances of women in particular who were knocked so hard that they went into seizures and had to go to the hospital. In Buffalo, New York, an older man who was in his 70s was knocked so hard that you could hear like a block of wood hitting the concrete, and blood poured out of his ears. That's how violent these cops have been in these peaceful protests. But you saw none of that. You saw none of that yesterday.
I also would like to say that when I was assaulted by a police officer and violently pushed to the ground, I was denied his badge number. I was denied access to who he was, which is totally inappropriate. Yeah. And there was a number of cases that came out, and people are trying to, bring this to light and all of that. But it was an incredibly violent and traumatic moment for me, and it was caught on video. And there are so many other people who have experienced incredible violence and has not been caught on video. Yeah. What you see caught on video, whether it's murders or whether it's police violence, is a small percentage of the amount of violence that we experience at the hands of cops that is just not caught on video. I think that's a really important thing for folks to understand, that just because we now have access to many of them, there's so many other acts of violence that just are never seen, reported, witnessed, because it just wasn't caught on video.
Well, and here's something to remember here. There may not be any place in the United States that has more surveillance cameras than Washington, D.C. There is no reason that every person who stepped a foot past the point of breaching the Capitol grounds can't be identified with their facial recognition software. Look, and don't even give me the whole mask thing, because a lot of these people weren't even wearing masks. And at some point, you see like the guy with the brown Harley jacket on who was destroying the media camp that was set up in that one area. I mean, even if he had a mask on, at some point, it should not be that impossible. These are supposed to be the most sophisticated law enforcement agencies in the world. There's no way they should not be able to identify these guys. And look, and I understand that they're going to be after, well, we want to find out who the leadership was. A lot of stuff was set up to not have leadership. It was just throw a bunch of angry white, obsessed white supremacists into a toxic soup and then light some matches. And it doesn't matter if who lit the match. They all should be held accountable for the responsibility for their roles in this thing, including Donald Trump, including his family, including every one of those senators and congressmen who were a part of this. And there are literally some suggestions that there may have been some Republican senators who opened the doors for some of these guys. And I heard Chuck Schumer, who I'm not a big fan of, but I heard him saying, we're trying to investigate to find out if any of these people who breached the Capitol were aided by by members of Congress. I mean, I guess the other thing that I have to say, in the wake of this thing, there are actually people who have taken out their Trump flags and put them on display. Some of them have come down since the election. But I know in the area that I live in here, which is surrounded by Western New York, there are more Trump flags out on display today than there was yesterday.
I also don't want this to be lost because it's relevant to what we were talking about earlier in terms of anti-Semitism, but also relevant to what you're discussing in terms of state representatives participating in this. And yesterday, the Illinois representative, Mary Miller, was at the protest and was given the mic and spoke about her support for this. And this is incredible because I can't believe that this is the reality. But she actually quoted Hitler in her speech and said, and I quote, said, Hitler was right about one thing. He said, whoever has the youth has the future, end quote. This is a U.S. elected representative quoting Adolf Hitler on the lawn of the state capitol before they entered the Capitol. I'm not shocked because, we're talking about U.S. history being just drenched with racism, and we talk about this all the time every week. But I just need people to know that this is not, these are some crazy right-wing nuts. These are elected officials who are participating in violent rhetoric to participate in convincing the youth that they should also be racist and be white supremacists. Like, this is an incredible moment in history because white people can no longer escape the realities that y'all participate and perpetuate violence and elect people who do the same.
These aren't lunatic fringe. The bottom line is this is not lunatic fringe. These are people who are elected by predominantly white people. I mean, and so make no mistake about it. This is not the exception. 70 million people voted for Donald Trump the second time around. 10 million more people voted for him in his loss than in his so-called victory. And like I said, the fact that people are actually putting up Trump flags in the wake of what took place yesterday, man, this isn't over. I did hear, I can't think of what his name is, but one of the guys on CNN was suggesting that we don't know is what transpired yesterday the end of something or the beginning of something, Or frankly, is it the middle of something? I said, look, people think the Civil War only lasted 4 years and that ended in 1865. And there are Confederate flags flying around where I live here in the Western New York area. There are Confederate flags flying all over the place. What is the purpose of that? If it's not to promote white supremacy, the idea that it is a racist symbol is undeniable. I mean, and this is the world that we live in. So I'm not apologizing for relishing in any way, shape, or form on what I witnessed yesterday. And you know what? Somebody got shot. I'm also not mourning her death either. I'm sorry. I'm not sorry. Sorry, I'm not sorry. I'm not mourning anybody's death in this thing. This thing was concocted. It was planned. It was aided and abetted by elected officials, by police officers. And I'm not saying every elected official, and I'm not saying every police officer, but this was a setup. And the media frenzy is incredible. No, go ahead.
I am saying it's every elected official and every cop, because every elected official and every cop participates in upholding the status quo, and the status quo is white supremacy. And people can no longer escape that, but need to reckon with the contradictions that they live in every day and begin to rectify and honestly unpack the world that you want to live in moving forward. And that requires a relinquishing of white control, a destruction of capitalism, the destruction of colonialism, and indigenous and black sovereignty. This all comes back to that, because we cannot escape these conversations anymore.
We have to fight racism.
Avoid them.
It's not enough to say that you're not racist. If you're not anti-racist, if you're not fighting against racism, then you are complicit. Because silence is complicity. Silence. Regan, I want to thank you so much. It's good to catch up with you, even on this subject. Who the hell knows what we'll have to talk about next week? I mean, who knows?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, John. It's always a pleasure, y'all.
All right. And thank you for listening. And we'll see you next week. Yahweh.